welcome to Berwick Heritage Open Days and the From Ditch to Bastion tour. The medieval defences in Berwick are often overlooked by their more obvious counterparts, the Elizabethan ramparts. And that's a great shame, because these are the walls that actually saw some action. The earliest defensive structure in Berwick is the castle, probably built by King David of Scotland about 1120. It's important to remember that Berwick is situated on a peninsula with the North Sea to the east and to the west the River Tweed. It was probably in the 1290s that the burgesses of Berwick were commanded to dig a ditch across the north of the peninsula, and we can see part of it here today. This is Spades Mire, which stretches all the way to the cliffs, terminating in a rise you might be able to see just to the right of that white building, which is known in a record of 1318 as the Elstenburg, the Old Stone Fort. And ahead of me, the ditch extends behind the middle school towards the railway line, where once there was a reservoir called the Tappy Pond, which fed the water for the town and also the later medieval ditches. By the end of the 13th century, Berwick had become a very prosperous town in Scotland. However, all this came to an end with the untimely death of Alexander III of Scotland after a riding accident in 1286. He died without an heir, and so a group of noblemen and clergy got together, called themselves the Guardians of Scotland, and decided to choose who should be the next king. There were 13 contenders for the post, and whether it was them checking out or not, I don't really know, but they obviously decided we're not worthy. The only person worthy to choose a king is another king, and so they get in contact with Edward I of England and asked him to adjudicate on the matter. He did, and the first hearings of testimonies from these contenders were held at Norham Castle in 1291. This took some time, and essentially there were only two real contenders, John Balliol and Robert Bruce. Edward made his final adjudication in November 1292 at Berwick Castle on the site of the railway station. He chose John Balliol, who was known thereafter as the Puppet King. However, whoever had been chosen, there would have been strings attached, as Edward believed he was overlord of Scotland. So that meant that John Balliol had to pay homage to him. However, this put him in a tough place. On the one hand, he had Edward I, an overbearing overlord. On the other hand, he had some very angry Scottish nobility to contend with. And finally, in 1295, he decided not to pay homage to Edward. Edward was miffed, to say the least, and invaded Scotland, starting with Berwick-upon-Tweed in 1296. Edward stayed in Berwick for about a month, and the first thing he ordered was for a ditch and embankment to be dug around the north and the east sides of the town, about 80 foot wide and 40 foot deep. Now, I've done a rough survey of the ditch here at Bell Tower, and yes, it's about 80 foot wide, and what with much later infill, I can imagine it could have been 40 foot deep. Now, throughout history, the way to dig any early earthwork like this is to dig a ditch and then throw the soil up behind you to form an embankment. So you get a nice sinoid curve like this. And that's what we appear to have here. A nice ditch and a raised embankment there. However, that's not quite right. That isn't the embankment, that's a much later development called the countermure, which I'll tell you about soon. In reality, the ditch was dug on both sides, so you get very shallow embankments thrown up on either side, which we can see better around the east side of the walls. Originally, there would have been a wooden palisade behind the ditch. Eventually, it was it would gradually be replaced by the stone wall. However, by the time Robert the Bruce finally took Berwick in 1318, the wall can only have been about 8 foot high. As the epic poem by Barber called The Bruce says, a man might strike another in the eye with a spear. In other words, you really could take out someone's eye with a sharp stick. And it was actually Bruce who took it upon himself to raise the walls eventually to a height of about 30 foot. I'm now behind the countermuir. When you're researching the medieval defences, there are two invaluable sources of information. The first is a series of plans drawn by Master Mason Roland Johnson in about 1562. Ostensibly they're the blueprints for the Elizabethan ramparts, but they show the medieval walls in great detail. The second is a survey from about 1538. It tells us the names of the towers, the distances between them, the tower dimensions, and so on. Now, I was wandering around here looking at the walls for the 1000th time, and I was wondering about the countermuir because it says in the survey here it was 32 foot wide and presumably it was about 30 foot high to match the height of the walls. And I was wondering to myself, where did the soil come from? You see, before the coming of the railways, the most expensive part of any building project was transportation. So you know that they're not going to have brought the soil from very far away. But where? You're not going to take it from the fields at Magdalen Fields. So where? And then I noticed Roland Johnson's maps, a feature I hadn't noticed before. He's very consistent and very accurate in the way he depicts the terrain. We see the countermuir as a stippled green band, and in front of that, two very thin black lines denoting the stone wall, and in front of that, blue hatching denoting the ditch. But behind the countermuir is more blue stippling. Is that another ditch? Look, you can even see in green what might be interpreted as bridges over the ditch to the towers. So my theory is that what they did was to dig a ditch, rather like the classic way of digging a ditch, but instead of throwing up the soil behind you, you're throwing the soil up in front of the ditch to strengthen the walls. It's all very well and good having a tall, thin wall, about 30 foot high, 12 foot wide at the base and 8 foot wide at the top. That's going to stop nasty people with scaling ladders, but it's not so good at stopping nasty people with cannon. So the purpose of the countermuir is to strengthen the wall against bombardment. Now here we see one of the first stages of evolution to the Elizabethan bastion system. Because of the advent of cannon, they converted the towers into gun chambers. So the semicircular towers were filled up with earth, but there were tunnels leading through the countermuir into ground floor gun chambers, which must have been held up with timber to keep the weight of soil above from caving in. That must have been some engineering achievement. And the gun ports, they were at either side of the tower so that it could provide lateral fire along the curtain wall. Now the next problem is, what happened to the countermuir? We see the remains of it here, but nothing like as much as they must have been at the time. Quite simply, the stone wall in front degraded over time, robbed out, and the countermuir collapsed forward to give the impression of a classic embankment. But also, where's the ditch? Well, that was just backfilled. Either naturally the soil from the countermuir slumped back in, or possibly it was deliberate. In 1751, a gentleman called George Locke came up from Newcastle to set up the Berwick Rope Company. And he set up Berwick's first ropery on this site. The main buildings were behind me at Bell Tower School, and they stretched along where those buildings are, and then the ropery itself stretched all the way along behind the length of the walls. I'm standing next to the bell tower, one of Berwick's most prominent landmarks, and it's that saved it from demolition in the late 19th century. It was a really useful navigational aid for ships out at sea. It stands on the alignment of the medieval walls, but it's not medieval. It's actually later than the Elizabethan ramparts. as we're told that it was rebuilt in 1577 in 8 cants, meaning sides, 26 foot high in stone and surmounted by 14 foot of timber. And it's this timber structure where the bell was actually located. There's only one image of it. It's a rather mysterious picture in the antechamber of the town hall. I think that dates from about 1700, and it clearly shows this very tall, thin additional stack on top of the stone bell tower. The way that the alarm system worked was quite simple. As well as the bell, there was a flag. So if you saw 3 ships come sailing by on Christmas morn, or indeed any other morn, you would point the flag in that direction and toll the bell 3 times. If you saw 5 horsemen riding over Halidon Hill, you'd point the flag in that direction, toll the bell 5 times. And if you saw 1,000 strong army coming over the hill, I suppose you'd like heck and hope somebody came. The penalty for falling asleep on duty at the bell tower was death. That's how important a job it was. The story of the building of the bell tower is quite complicated. We know from Roland Johnson's maps that all the towers along here, they were semicircular, proud of the curtain wall. We also know from the 1538 survey that their bell tower was on the site of Lord's Mount, just behind me. That was built in about 1540. We'll be looking at that shortly. Now, in about 1900, Commander Norman wrote an early tourist guide for Berwick. He'd obviously been inside the bell tower and described what he found, that there was a base to one of the original medieval towers inside. I was lucky enough to be able to have a look inside, and what I found is not what I expected. For a start, I thought this base was going to be right down at a low level, but it's not. Above me you can see this blocked up doorway. The base extends to the height of the foot of the door. Also, whereas the medieval towers were semicircular, what we see inside is a complete circle straddling the width of the walls like our bell tower does. So it can't be an original medieval tower as Commander Norman would have had it. So what is it? Now, if they demolished the original bell tower when they built Lord's Mount in 1540 and they built this in 1577, that means that there would have been no alarm system here for 37 years. I don't buy that. I think that this base is an intermediate tower, if you want to call it that. We know that in 1568, or by 1568, all the walls along here have been lowered from 30 foot high down to 17 foot high. And the bottom of that doorway is indeed 17 foot above the ground behind the countermuir. So what I think happened was they demolished the original bell tower at Lord's Mount. They then convert the original semicircular tower into a full circle and house the bell in that. The walls are then all lowered to 17 foot high, and this, as the record says, is rebuilt in 1577. Okay. There's not very much left of medieval Berwick, which is a great shame considering the history here. But if you look closely, there are 1 or 2 little bits and pieces you can see. Behind the medieval walls there used to be 2 12th century friaries, and down here you can see a little bit of one of them. Can you see here? Just built into this garden wall is a stone with a cross of St Cuthbert on it. It's truncated here, but about here you can see the end of it quite nicely. I'll bet that's just a little bit of one of those friaries. I'm standing in front of the Wallish Gate. Wallish is an Anglo-Saxon word meaning others, foreigners, hence Welsh, and ultimately the surname Wallace derives from this. It was a fairly massive affair. There were two gates in it, one for the in traffic and the other for the out traffic, presumably. The other gates in town looked rather like the Cowgate within the Elizabethan ramparts. This carried the road to Edinburgh. It ran from the centre of town up Church Street, up Wallace Green, forget the Elizabethan fortifications, they haven't been built yet, through Low Greens and then through here on the way up to the Morrison Strait. Of course, with the Elizabethan fortifications being built, that cut off this route, and it's only then that the North Road was built to connect the Morrison Strait onto what was the road to the borders, now Castle Terrace. In the 1540s, Henry VIII started another programme of works at Berwick. Amongst these were the water tower and the west gun tower at the castle, and also here in the northeast corner of the walls, Lord's Mount, on the site of the very early bell tower. Now it's called Lord's Mount because it was designed by the king himself, but not quite. In 1542, a couple of government inspectors came up to see how work was progressing. Much to their dismay, it wasn't what the king had designed, and they asked the master mason on the project, what's happening? And he basically explained, well, what the king's designed is very lovely, but have you seen how much money the treasury have sent up? It's nothing like enough. It's cost me £12,500 already, and I still need a lot more to get it finished. And so I basically just interpreted the king's plans as best I can, and they were sent away with a flea in their ear with a new plan showing what he had done. But it's still a lovely structure. Let's go inside and have a look. Lord's Mount would have looked very similar to Portland Castle on the south coast near Weymouth. Portland Castle was one of a series of device forts built by Henry VIII in the 1530s and 40s against a potential threat of attack from France. There was another one built on the south coast of Wales and also at Hull, but the only other one is right up here in Berwick-upon-Tweed. And here at the east end of the semicircular block seems to be the domestic setup. Here we've got the well. It's not that deep, I don't think there's any buried treasure at the bottom of it. And at the side here we have this circular groove here, which undoubtedly would have had a wheels, part of some winch mechanism to draw water up from the well. Opposite the well is what appears to be the main kitchen area. This appears to be perhaps a main range. There's a groove in the paving stones below, which appears to be, I don't know, some drainage channel perhaps, or something for collecting fat from an animal that's turning on a spit. And in the corner here we have a typical bread oven. Inside it's domed, paved with stone. Get a fire going in there. Once it's up to the right temperature, you scrape the ashes and burning embers out and put in your dough, and that's the bread for the day. The whole place is designed to be self-sufficient, as it would have to be if it came under attack. This is a strange little room. The English Heritage panel outside describes this as being a gunpowder store. It might be, I don't know. But at Portland Castle there's a very similar structure at the centre of the fort, and it's described there as being the officers' mess. So maybe this was a sort of small recreation room for the officers, maybe even sleeping quarters. Who could say? And like Portland Castle, Lord's Mount is now exposed to the air, but originally both would have had an open gun deck on top, so this would all have been enclosed. Here there are 6 magnificent gun ports covering all angles to the north. There's also two magnificent Tudor arched fireplaces. It's an interesting theory. Would they have been lit if the guns were being fired? It would have been horrendously smoke-filled, this area, and maybe the drafts from the fires helped remove the smoke. Whether the fires worked or not, I don't know, but certainly there are these massive smoke vents. You can see the same thing at the water tower at the castle, but they're a lot smaller than these. So these would have got rid of the smoke, hopefully. I can't imagine what it would have been like operating the cannon in this very enclosed area. The fireplaces, of course, also suggest that maybe this was the general living quarters for the gunners working here. There were probably a crew of about 6 to each cannon, maybe 4. I'm not an expert on these things at all. So if there's 6 cannon down on this level, presumably another 6 up on the upper level, and then you've got officers, then we're talking about something like 50-60 men quartered in this one tower. On the outside wall of the inner area, there's quite a few masons' marks. Masons would be paid by piecework, so they had to mark what stones they had finished so that the master mason would then pay them accordingly. And if you keep your eyes peeled, you can see these marks around this area. Just got to keep your eye out. Once you get your eye in, you can see quite a few of them. Oh look, here's one here. And where else? I used to know where they all were. There's one here. Come to daddy, come to daddy. This is the thing about erosion. Yeah. On the east side of the building, we can see the remains of some steps which must have had some wooden steps leading down from them to the ground. But here we've got a rather magnificent flight of steps that would have led up to the upper gun deck. In 1482, the Duke of Gloucester, later Richard III, took Berwick for England for what turned out to be the last time. Of course, that didn't mean the Scots didn't want it back. And so in 1520, there was a large programme of extra defences for the medieval walls. These were a series of bulwarks around the town. 2 still exist. One behind me was positioned in the northeast corner in front of what was their bell tower, now our Lord's Mount, and another one halfway down the east side of the walls known as the Great Bulwark in the Snook. In 1522, a commissioner came up to Berwick to see how work was progressing, and he wrote back complaining about the lack of bulwarks and murderers in town. That's a very odd thing to say. What does he mean by murderers? Well, when one looks at the 1538 survey and Roland Johnson's maps, one can see 2 projections sticking out of 2 of the towers. One where the bell tower is now, and one here at the murderer tower. These were stone platforms built forward. Presumably the towers were too small to convert into gun chambers, and so these platforms with a triangular front were a platform for cannon to fire laterally along the walls. And this is a very important development when it comes to the evolution of the bastion system, as we shall see. Just to the right of the tower, hopefully you can see the lawn from the house behind is spilling forward through a gap in the wall. That's a postern gate. This is where patrols of soldiers would come out, usually at night. The bell tower and its warning system is all very well, but that only operates during the daytime. And so it was that the scout watch, as they were known, would have to come out to patrol the fields around the town to make sure there were no incursions. Now, I'm standing on what they call a partition of earth. I don't know if you can see, but the ditch to my right is very much lower than that to my left. That's because the land to the north is very much higher than the land to the south. The ditches were filled with water from the Tappy Pond, and of course if there was one continuous ditch, then the water would just run all the way down and out into the river at the south end. And so they built this series of stanks, or ponds as they have referred to, divided by these partitions of earth, so you get a stepped effect, rather like locks on a canal. I'm standing just to the north of Bastion, the northeast bastion on the Elizabethan ramparts. To my left we have the longest extant section of the medieval walls running to here from Lord's Mount. Behind me, where this small rise is roughly the position of the middle tower. The walls then ran underneath Bastion, where the red tower was, along the middle of the football pitch, the stanks, and then down to the river in the southeast, just outside the Elizabethan walls. To conclude the film, I've come south of the Cowport to Flagstaff Park. To my side we have Windmill Bastion, and on this side we have the medieval walls. Just above my finger is the Conduit Tower, and behind that a larger mound, the Great Bulwark and the Snook. They're very conveniently positioned next to each other because, using an aerial photograph and some overlays, I can sum up all the features of the medieval walls in this short animation, comparing them to the Elizabethan walls. So first of all, this line shows the medieval wall alignment, and this line obviously the Elizabethan walls. Now I'll add on the countermuir where I'm standing to the back of the medieval walls, and here's the massive earthwork behind the Elizabethan walls. I'll just add a couple of towers on to the medieval walls. Here's the Conduit Tower and an unnamed tower that's just to the north of it. Now, outside of that, we have the Great Bulwark and the Snook, which was added in the 1520s to defend what must have been seen as a relatively weak part of the defences. I'll add in the main body of the bastion now. You can see the similarity in shape even. The only difference is that the bastion is attached directly to the curtain wall. Both offer cannon fire out into the field. Now I'll just add on a couple of murderers to the towers. Thank you very much. And here we have the flankers either side of Windmill Bastion. And the only difference is that the flankers are defended by these projecting structures called orelons, or ears, which protect the flankers from enemy attack. Both offer crossfire along their curtain wall, as you can see here. So that's basically how the Elizabethan bastion style of defence must have grown up throughout Europe, and we can see it all here in Berwick, which is probably fairly unique. I'll be exploring how the Elizabethan bastions worked in more detail and everything else about the Elizabethan walls in another film. If you want to know more about the medieval walls, check out the Riverside Walls film. If you have any questions or queries, please email me via our website, Berwick Heritage Open Days, or via social media. Thank you for watching.